When you listen to Japanese people, you often hear a sentence like this.
この中で好きなものはありますか？
銀玉です。銀玉めちゃめちゃ好きです。
She said, "Gintama mecha mecha suki desu." I like gintama very much. Now let's remove mecha mecha to make it simple. Gintama suki desu. I like gintama. And did you notice that there's no particle after gintama? And yes, we can technically insert particles like ga or wa here, but she didn't. Why is that? And a lot of people say that, oh, she just omitted a particle. But particles are not as simple as that. You can't always explain this kind of zero particle construction as simple omission. And I'm going to use the term zero particle because it's a neutral way of saying, well, there's no particle. If you use the word omission, this is an interpretation because you assume that there was something that has been omitted. It's kind of like when you text me, hey, let's hang out, and I reply, oh, I'm busy. And you said, oh, so you don't like me. Well, that's your interpretation. It's not a neutral description, which would be, I said, I'm busy. And I might actually be busy. I might actually want to watch this anime live streaming. It doesn't mean I don't like you. It just means I like my anime stream more. Anyway, I'm going to use the term zero particle as a neutral description. Now, let me start with another example. Let's say you try to use your smartphone and realize it's broken. You might say, あ、このスマホ壊れてる. Oh, this smartphone is broken. This means you shouldn't have gotten so drunk that you forgot you broke your smartphone. Very important life lesson. Hear the thunderstorm? Anyway, let's say you try to use your smartphone and realize that your smartphone is broken. You might say, あ、このスマホ壊れてる. Oh, this smartphone is broken. So with the sentence, あ、このスマホ壊れてる, there's no particle after スマホ. Now, if you think there's a particle that's been omitted, which particle would that be? Now, ga wouldn't fit here because if you say このスマホが壊れてる, it sounds like this is the smartphone that's broken, which means kind of like the underlying question is like which smartphone is broken, and you identify this as this is the one that's broken, so it doesn't fit here. And wa wouldn't fit here either because it would sound like you're contrasting, right? You're comparing different smartphones. This one is broken, this one is not broken, that one is not broken, but that's not what's going on here. So neither ga or wa work here, so you can't really say, oh, this is the particle that's been omitted. The original sentence, the zero particle version, このスマホ壊れてる, is actually a pretty neutral way of saying this, so it doesn't add any additional nuances that ga or wa would add. And since you can't identify the omitted particle, let alone agreeing with it, because if you insist, oh, it's ga or wa, other people will disagree. So this is not a simple case of omission. And in this case, I would say it's more accurate to say, oh, there's no particle in the first place. So this is the original sentence. And a lot of research papers I've read on this specific topic, they would agree with me. Now, let me give you another example. By the way, the noise is raining pretty hard. I'm sorry for the noise. Now, let me give you another example. A guy and a girl go on a date and watch a movie together, or like 5 movies in a row. After that, they go to a restaurant, but there are some kids that are being noisy. The guy wants to ignore the kids, so he said, 映画面白かったね. The movie was interesting, right? Now, there's no particle after 映画. Again, can you say there's a particle that's been omitted? Ga wouldn't fit here because it would sound like you are singling out the movie, like amongst other things that we did, it's the movie that was interesting. 映画が面白かったね. But that's not the context here. What wouldn't fit either, because if you say 映画は面白かったね, it could sound like, oh, the kids are noisy, but the movie was interesting. Like, レストランはうるさいけど、映画は面白かったね. It's noisy in this restaurant, but the movie was interesting. That's not the only interpretation, but this is one of the possible interpretations. But again, that's not what he means, so neither ga nor wa would fit in this context. So this is not a simple case of omission. You can say the original zero particle version, 映画面白かったね, has its own nuances, like a neutral way of describing the movie was interesting. So there was no particle in the first place. Just like this, a lot of zero particle constructions like 映画面白かったね or このスマホ壊れてる have their own meanings that neither ga or wa or other particles can represent. Zero particle can kind of function like a particle in itself. But here's the thing. That doesn't mean there are no situations where you can say, oh, they omitted the particle. Example, let's say you're texting your friend because you totally have friends, unlike this pink-haired lonely girlie. And you're telling them you're coming over at 6 p.m. Now, you'd usually text, 6時に行くね, I'll go there at 6 p.m. using ni. But today, you just can't be bothered to type ni because you got drunk yesterday and your smartphone is broken and it's barely functioning. You can still text, but it's broken. So you end up texting, 6時行くね, I'll go there at 6 p.m. So you left out ni. And here, we can say he omitted ni because I think in this situation, most native speakers default to using ni and say, 6時に行くね. And also, there's no significant differences in nuances between 6時に行くね with ni and 6時行くね without ni. So we could say this is omission. Of course, some people could disagree, but I don't expect a lot of people would. So, there are situations where a lot of people say, yeah, this is not omission, but there are other situations where a lot of people would say, yeah, this is omission. But what makes this more difficult is that there are a lot of cases in between. Let's go back to the first example. 銀玉好きです. I like 銀玉.
銀玉めちゃめちゃ好きです。
Is this omission not? And here, I'd expect more people to disagree because 銀玉が好きです would also make sense in this context. I would still say this ga can add more nuances like it's 銀玉 that I like. But you can also say 銀玉が好きです in a more neutral way. So there's room for interpretation. Although if you hear what she says next, you can see this zero particle construction has its own meaning.
この中で好きなものはありますか？
銀玉です。銀玉めちゃめちゃ好きです。本当あとドラゴンボールが好きなんですけど。
She said, 本当はあとドラゴンボールが好きなんですけど. I actually really like Dragon Ball apart from Gintama, and she used ga here. I can explain this ga because this ga can imply something like it's actually Dragon Ball that I really like. And Dragon Ball isn't on the list, right? So ga has this singling out feature function that this is the one that I like amongst other possible choices. So when she said, 銀玉めちゃめちゃ好きです, she just wants to say she likes Gintama, but then when she said, 本当はドラゴンボールが好きなんですけど, she wanted to say Dragon Ball is actually the anime that I really like. Again, this is not the only possible interpretation, but I would say it's a very plausible interpretation. But I hope you can see that zero particle constructions often has its own meanings and functions, and we actively choose them because they can carry some nuances that other particles can't. Now, many pedagogical resources, such as popular textbooks like Genki or Minna no Nihongo, can be very misleading about zero particle constructions. I'm not saying every textbook because I don't know every textbook. I only know the textbooks that I know, but many popular ones, right? They can be blatantly misleading. For example, Minna no Nihongo, Volume 1, Chapter 20, page 170, 例文2, it says, そこにハサミがある? Are there scissors there? And here, ga is in the brackets, which of course implies that you can omit it. But the misleading part is up to this point, right? Chapter 20 is where Minna no Nihongo introduces plain Japanese without using des or mas. So when Minna no Nihongo used des or masu, it would always add ga here and say, そこにハサミがありますか? Are there scissors over there? But as soon as it introduces plain Japanese, it implies that you can drop it. Now, what would you infer from this presentation? I think a lot of people incorrectly infer that when we speak plain Japanese, you can omit particles, but when we use des or mas, you can't, which is completely not true at all. Like, this rule doesn't exist. Plain Japanese, des mas, that's not a determining factor of zero particle constructions. I mean, our very first example, 銀玉めちゃめちゃ好きです. I really like 銀玉. She's using des, so this is not plain Japanese, but this is a zero particle construction. So plain Japanese, des mas, that's not a determining factor. But then the question is, when do we use zero particle constructions and when do we don't? And I've actually read a lot of research papers on this, and they try to identify different situations where we tend to use zero particle constructions. And the list can be quite long, but I will give you an example. There is a 2003 paper titled 無助詞分の分類と段階性 The Classification and Gradients of Zero Particle Constructions. And one example is 聞き手の情報を求める文 which means something like sentences in which the speaker asks the listener about their knowledge, abilities, possessions, preferences, experiences, whether they have completed an action. And one of the examples they have is pouring coffee and you ask your friend, ミルク入れる? Do you want some milk? Should I put some milk? And he or she didn't use any particle after ミルク. In other words, adding some particles like or wouldn't work here because it adds some meanings or nuances that doesn't fit in this situation. Now, there's a sentence from Genki, page 225. It says, もう One Piece を見ましたか? Have you watched One Piece already? And I've always thought, well, we wouldn't use or here. This sounds strange. And papers like this can identify this is actually one of the conditions where the speaker asks the listener about their knowledge, abilities, possession, preferences, experiences, right? Or whether they have completed an action. So this is the kind of situation when we use zero particle constructions. So there's actually a lot of research that tries to identify situations where we use zero particle constructions and sometimes why other particles like or, ga, wa wouldn't fit here. And a lot of pedagogical resources ignore those situations which make their sentences sound pretty weird because we don't hear what we expect to hear in the given situations. Of course, that doesn't mean every single sentence in a textbook sounds weird. A lot of sentences sound fine, but many of them do sound weird because of reasons like this. And I would say this is one of the fundamental flaws of a lot of pedagogical resources, not all, but a lot of them, because you're missing out on the opportunities to acquire how to use particles properly. Particles and zero particle constructions have a lot of meanings semantically and pragmatically. And those meanings are very important because that's how we use particles. If you strip those meanings from the particles and present them as though they don't exist, that can mislead a lot of learners. And I've met a lot of learners who are misled. So this could be a huge problem. You and I both know that particles are very hard to acquire, right? Particles are hard. They're hard to acquire, they're hard to explain. And one of the reasons why particles are so hard is because something like low salience, right? Like even if you don't understand particles, you can still understand the gist of a message. If I say, 空が赤い, the sky is red, you don't really have to understand what this ga implies here. If you understand sora, the sky, and akai, red, you can understand that I'm saying the sky is red. Because of this, even you're exposed to a lot of particles, you don't really have to understand them. And that's one of the reasons why particles are so hard to acquire for learners. And Japanese kids too. It takes them years to acquire particles. You can actually acquire a lot of Japanese intuitively just from exposure. You don't have to read explanations for every single aspect of the language. But there are things, such as particles, that are just hard to pick up. So with particles, you can greatly benefit from realistic examples and explanations. But when I say this, many people say, but that will be too difficult for beginners. Well, not necessarily, and I'm gonna demonstrate. Imagine this dialogue. Anime 好きですか? Do you like anime? 好きです. I like anime. 何が好きですか? What do you like? クズの本会が好きです. I like Scum's Wish. クズの本会が好きなんですか? Oh, you like Scum's Wish. Now let me explain how particles are used. The first question, アニメ好きですか? doesn't have any particle after anime because it's a neutral question. There are actually other particles like wa or te that would work here, but I actually created another video for that, so you can maybe watch it. And then she said, 何が好きですか? What do you like? Using ga. This is because when we use question words like 何, what, 誰, who, どこ, where, we normally use ga. And you can think of this as the singling out feature of ga, which among others is the one. And you can also say 何好きですか? which is also fine. less of the singling out nuance. Then she said, クズの本会が好きです。I like scumfish. And she used ga because the underlying question is 何が. So she identifies scumfish is the anime that I like. And here she can also say クズの本会好きです, which to me sounds a bit more neutral without the additional singling out nuance. But this is not the only correct interpretation here. And I think it's important to acknowledge that particles can be ambiguous and also subjective. The same sentence, different people might interpret it differently. But there are some interpretations that a lot of native speakers agree. And in my videos, I often say like, oh, I asked other native speakers and they agreed, to make sure that this is not just my opinion. Anyway, then she said, クズの本会が好きなんですか? Oh, you like scumfish. And she's using ga because when you react to somebody's statement, and when you are a bit surprised, for example, she's surprised because scumfish is a highly sophisticated intellectual anime, and she's surprised that this pink-haired lonely girlie has such sophisticated taste in anime. Anyway, when you're reacting something, and especially when you're using desu, it's very common to use ga. So that's why she said, クズの本会が好きなんですか? Oh, you like クズの本会. And yes, understanding every single point here might be a little too challenging for some people, but if I pick up one single sentence and explain, I think many people will understand. At least it's not super overwhelming. So tell me what you think. But I think you can see that particles are very complicated and there's so many situations where we use particles differently. So consciously thinking about every single situation when you speak Japanese is not a practical thing. You have to make this your intuition. You have to intuitively acquire particles from different examples while paying attention to particles and zero particle constructions. So if you acquire Japanese from natural but easy examples that use particles properly, maybe you can subscribe to my email group because I have both free and paid lessons where you can acquire natural Japanese with natural but easy and properly contextualized examples. So click on the link in the description and subscribe to my email group. Alright, so most people have stopped watching this video and went back to watching family-friendly anime for research purposes. I think we can go deeper and talk about some other research. The 2003 paper I mentioned earlier, this is pretty informative. And my first example, このスマホ壊れてる, was actually inspired by another example on this paper. あ、この時計止まってる. Ah, this clock had stopped. And interestingly, if you remove この, you can add が and say, あ、時計が止まってる. Oh, the clock has stopped. And why does this happen? Well, the paper explains that if you say この時計, it sounds like this specific clock. If you add が, it sounds like this is the specific clock that stopped, right? But if you say 時計が止まってる, it's more like a general observation, like there's a clock that stopped. So この here is the determining factor. And I find it quite fascinating just adding words like この can change the way we use particles. And there's another important functions of particles that this paper didn't mention, which is segmentation. What do I mean by that? I said with the example from Genki, One Piece をもう見ましたか? We wouldn't use を here. This is a simple sentence. There's just one sentence. In this case, we would say, One Piece もう見ましたか? But what if this was a more complex sentence, like, One Piece をもう見た人は誰ですか? Who are the people that have already watched One Piece? Now, this is a complex sentence because One Piece をもう見た人 functions like a gigantic noun, and 誰ですか can be an independent sentence. And here, One Piece をもう見た is a subordinate clause to use a grammatical term. And as a subordinate clause, we tend to use を. But yeah, one of the things that case particles like が or can do is signaling segmentation. So when we hear One Piece をもう見た, we kind of expect this to be a subordinate clause. We start expecting maybe this is a complex sentence. And while it's possible to actually say One Piece もう見た人いますか? I would say we would naturally use を in this situation and say One Piece をもう見た人いますか? Because it kind of facilitates communication by signaling, okay, this is a huge chunk and this is another huge chunk. So particles can have this kind of segmentation signaling function. This aspect is discussed in this paper, the pragmatic nature of the so-called subject marker ga in Japanese. And here they're talking about ga, but o can also have this kind of function. Now there's another interesting paper called Mujoshibun to wa nanika? What's a zero particle sentence? And this one is from 2008. And it discusses how we construct zero particle constructions. And here's one of the examples. Imagine there are two people and there is a ball between them. And she wants him to give the ball to her because she thinks she's more important than him. Now she could just say, boru, boru, and he could understand she wants the ball. Or she could say, chodai, give it to me, and he might understand. This sentence is a very minimum. But to make it clearer, she can say, boru chodai, can you give me the ball? And he can give it to her. Here, she doesn't have to use any particles after boru because the context and the sentence are pretty clear. Like at this point, there's no additional information needed to make it clearer. But what if she said boru chodai, but he couldn't catch the word boru? Now he might ask, nani o? What do you want? And then she might add o and say, boru o chodai, emphasizing ball. And she's using o because there's an additional context that requires her to specify its or emphasize its ball. In this example, we didn't start with boru o chodai and remove words from this sentence. We start with a very simple one-word sentence like chodai, and we progressively add more words as needed. From this perspective, she didn't omit particles. She actually added particles as needed. And the paper says that this is how babies acquire Japanese. When a baby starts speaking, they start with one word, like boru, boru, chodai, chodai. And those one-word sentences have very broad interpretation. And later, when they start acquiring particles, they become even more specific, like boru o chodai, it's the ball that I want you to give to me. Again, babies don't learn Japanese by omitting particles. They started adding particles to more basic sentences as they learn more Japanese. And when I read the paper, I was like, that's what I was thinking. Like in many cases, we don't start with complex sentences and make shorter sentences by omitting a bunch of stuff. It's the other way around. We start with very simple sentences and we add stuff as needed. And I think paying attention to this kind of cognitive aspect of particles can be beneficial because while we use certain particles, like a surface level sentence doesn't fully capture. There's a lot of context and intentions, what's going on in our mind and what we have been thinking. So if you want to learn Japanese with me, you can maybe join my email group because I have both free and paid lessons where you can acquire Japanese with natural but realistic and fully contextualized sentences and examples. So click on the link on the screen or in the description and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta.